Please joining me in welcoming Dr. Christie Vanorsdale.
Hi, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm so excited to be here. I was just noticing lots of people in the chat, lots of people from all over the place. I posted hello from Asheville, North Carolina. That's where I am connecting with you from today. And without further ado, let me go ahead and just get into it. I'm going to share my PowerPoint and okay, looks like everything's working the way it's supposed to. Okay, let's kick it off. So I'm going to introduce my talk at first, and then in the following slides, I'll talk a little bit more about me. So I am very honored to speak here today. This is one of the topics that are very near and dear to my heart, and it's a topic that started for me a very, very long time ago when I started out my journey as a classroom educator, which I'll get into as well more in a moment. But let me first start by saying there is a moment that every educator knows. You've been asked a question, you've waited, or sorry, you have asked a question and you've waited, and the room stayed completely silent. Most of us at some point have read that silence as failure, as perhaps disengagement, as proof that something we didn't land. And I want to spend the next 45 minutes making the case that silence and a lot of other things that we may read or perceive as failure might actually be something else entirely. So, a little bit more about me. I have one of those backgrounds that doesn't fit neatly into a single lane. I started in psychology, then I went deep into language acquisition, and more specifically, how to teach a language to speakers of other languages. I earned my master's in international education with a certificate in teaching English as a second language. And then I spent years doing teacher education, both in the United States and abroad. I've designed learning systems, learning management systems from scratch, working with developers to build bespoke platforms for very specific learner needs. I've redesigned face to face training, built fully online instructor led programs, and I've created self directed learning experiences at scale. My doctorate is in instructional technology with a focus on cognitive theories of multimedia learning. I've conducted research in teacher education, specifically how instructors give feedback, how they model thinking, and how they either reinforce the assumptions that learners bring into the room or disrupt them. I identify as a learning scientist, and I also understand the history of education deeply, how we got here, what organizational learning looks like across departments, how to bridge gaps between stakeholders, and how to demonstrate ROI for learning and development at the executive level. That's the full picture, and this talk draws on all of it. So, like I mentioned before, in 2008, that was my first time as a classroom teacher. I was teaching English as a foreign language at a place called the Cheongdam Institute, located in Seoul, South Korea. I had come from a psychology background, like I mentioned. I was deeply interested in how people learn, how the mind constructs meaning. And I walked into that classroom thinking I understood a lot about how learning worked. My students were bright, motivated, and almost completely silent when I asked questions or tried to engage with them verbally at all. I tried everything: more wait time, smaller groups, rephrasing, nothing. And then a Korean colleague said something to me that reframed my entire understanding. She said, "They aren't refusing to answer you. They don't want to disrupt the group by showing off in front of everyone." That was the moment I understood that the classroom experience I was expecting, one where individual students spoke up, competed for answers, demonstrated knowledge publicly, was operating on a set of cultural norms that weren't shared by the people I was asking to learn inside of it. The silence wasn't disengagement, it was a different framework for what learning in community is supposed to look like. I went on to teach at Sungmyang Women's University in Seoul years later. I earned my doctorate in instructional technology. I spent years in teacher education research. And that moment in that classroom in 2008 is still the center of gravity for everything that I do. Here is the central claim of this talk, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. The behaviors we call engaged, raising hands, asking questions, advocating for yourself, disagreeing openly, seeking help when you're lost, none of those are natural. None of those are universal. Every single one of them is taught culturally, socially, institutionally, which means that when a student doesn't do those things, it may not be because they can't, or because they're not motivated, or because they don't care. It may be because they are operating from a completely different an entirely legitimate set of beliefs about what learning in a community is supposed to look like. Every classroom is a cross cultural space, even if every single student was born in the same zip code. Today, I'm going to give you a framework for seeing that, for recognizing it, and a set of practical tools for designing learning environments that actually work across that difference. Before we go into the framework, I want to acknowledge what's already in the room. The students you work with are navigating a lot: full-time jobs, caregiving, being the first in their family to be there. That was me. I was one of those. Learning in environments that weren't designed with them in mind. This is not abstract. This is a cross-cultural space. It is the classroom you walk into every single day. And yet, most course design proceeds as if everyone arrives the same way, with the same relationship to authority, to asking for help, to what success is supposed to look like. That's what we're here to change today. The framework I want to share comes from Doctors Helene Marshall and Andrea De Capua. These are researchers who spent years studying what it actually takes to design learning environments that don't systematically exclude learners operating from non-dominant cultural norms. This framework has 4 layers: values, beliefs, attitudes, and norms. And we're going to unpack each one in just a moment. First, let's start with values. I like to start with values because they tend to be the one place where we all align. Values are the abstract ideals. And here's the thing about values: most people in most classrooms share them. Students and instructors broadly agree that success matters, that learning is worthwhile, that collaboration is good. Notice how values are what I like to call abstract ideals or abstract nouns. This is where we often stop, however. We see shared values and we assume we're working from shared assumptions. We're not, because the next level is where the divergence actually begins. So, beliefs are what we think is true about those shared values. So, if you start with the value of success, Then the next layer up the framework is what we believe to be true about success. And as I mentioned previously, that's often where things start to diverge interpersonally. Two students can both value success and hold completely different beliefs about what success requires. One believes that asking for help is a sign of engagement and intellectual honesty. Another believes that asking for help, especially in a public space, reveals that you may not belong here. Those beliefs are not random, they come from family, community, culture, prior schooling, and the various other caregivers, social media, the various different parts of culture and society that people interact with daily. And they are real, whether or not they are visible to you. Norms are the visible pieces. Norms are the behaviors that follow from beliefs. And if you believe asking questions demonstrates engagement, you raise your hand. That's your norm. If you believe it reveals deficiency, you find a workaround or you don't ask at all. Norms are the rules of engagement in any classroom. The problem is that we almost never say them out loud. We just enforce them. Attitudes are the fourth layer of the framework. They are the emotional layer. What happens when norms are upheld or when they're violated? This is where you get confusion, frustration, shame, and sometimes, in the best cases, revelation. When a student feels embarrassed in a classroom, it's often because a norm was violated they didn't even know existed. And that shame becomes a barrier to every subsequent learning interaction. This is the framework, and I want to show you exactly what it looks like in practice. Okay, let me make the framework concrete using another researcher's work. His name is Gert Hofstede, and he's done some work on um, individualism versus collectivism in terms of cultural dimensions. So, if we take a look at Gert Hofstede's individualism versus collectivism dimension, and I chose this one because it directly explains what I was experiencing on that day in that classroom in Seoul in 2008. Both orientations share the value of success. Recall that values are the foundational layer that we almost all agree on. These are abstract nouns, but the beliefs underneath are fundamentally different. In a highly individualist orientation, my success is my responsibility. Asking for help signals self advocacy. Public achievement is valued. Showing up to office hours demonstrates effort. In a more collectivist orientation, success is shared and relational. Asking for help risks burdening others. Standing out individually can disrupt collective flow. Staying quiet in a whole group setting honors the group. Neither of these are wrong. Both are internally consistent. But the classroom I designed in Seoul was built entirely around one of them. Can you guess which one? Here is what I actually did once I understood what was happening. I moved office hours to small group sessions. Questions emerged collectively. No individual exposure required. I introduced anonymous feedback channels with a comment box outside my office, and later with digital tools. A written submission is possible without attribution. This preserves that collectivist stance. The question still got answered. The asker stayed protected. I built peer support structures, collaborative review processes, group synthesis that honored collective learning norms. And guess what happened? When I transitioned to teaching to American college students, they loved all of these options too. That is the point. Good design doesn't accommodate one group at the expense of another. It expands conditions for everyone. That's when I realized that culture isn't just international, it's interpersonal. So let's unpack these concepts more with 3 examples using the same lens, each with different design problems. We're going to look at help seeking, collaboration, independence, and academic success. Okay, let's unpack your beliefs about the value of help. Do you believe that asking a question signals engagement, or does it reveal that you aren't keeping up? Take a moment and think about it. You can feel free to type it in the chat if you want. No wrong answers here, as I mentioned before. But I think this is a great example, and this is actually an experiment that I do with my pre-service education teachers um, here in the U.S. I challenge their understanding of this concept that we may all, we can all, we can all agree that help is something we value. We can all agree that success is something we value. We can all agree that communication is something we value, but what do we believe to be true about that value? And that is often where we start to see um, many people who maybe have been friends their whole lives, people who grew up in the same house, siblings, cousins, best friends, their values start to, or sorry, their beliefs start to diverge at that part of the branch. Just checking here. That's some of your responses in the chat. Wonderful. Depends on situations. Absolutely. I love that a lot of people are talking about what they were taught. I was taught that I should believe A, but culturally I believe B. Depends on the question. Absolutely. Belief B, social psychology at play. Yeah, curiosity, definitely. So, the first example, help seeking, that we're going to unpack. In dominant academic culture, asking questions is read as intellectual curiosity and self advocacy. It signals that you're engaged, that you're thinking, that you care. But there's a third possibility that our frameworks often don't make room for. They believe that asking for help in this context, in front of these people, is evidence that they don't belong here. Imposter syndrome is real, and it is not evenly distributed. Research consistently shows that students from historically underrepresented groups, first-generation college students, and students navigating significant cultural distance from dominant academic norms experience help seeking as a higher stakes act. The belief isn't irrational. In many contexts, it is entirely accurate. The question is, what does your classroom design say about that belief? Does it confirm it, or does it challenge it? And you can, of course, feel free to keep the chat going, the conversation going. I'm really looking forward to reading all of them in just a bit. So the design response has 2 parts. First, make your own beliefs explicit. Say out loud in your classroom, I ask questions when I'm confused. Confusion is part of learning. Questions don't signal that you don't belong, they signal that you're thinking. You're not just setting a norm for your students, you're modeling a belief. Second, create multiple pathways for questions that don't require public exposure. Anonymous digital submission tools, for example, we have lots of them now. Written questions before discussion takes place. Peer directed question protocols where students must ask each other first before asking you. Brief written reflections at the end of class where questions are collected without attribution. The goal is not to tell students that asking questions is fine. The goal is to make asking feel structurally and psychologically safe, not just personally invited. There is a real difference between a teacher who says, "My door is always open," and a classroom that is actually designed so that asking for help doesn't require courage. So, when we say work together, we assume everyone agrees on what that means. On this slide, we're going to unpack my second example, which is collaboration, or more commonly referred to as group work in the classroom context. And I want to make a bold claim. Most group work fails, not because of individual effort or ability. It fails because we never negotiated what working together is actually supposed to look like. That's Gert Hofstede, he's the researcher I mentioned a few slides ago. Hofstede's research on the value of interpersonal power distance explains whether a student will take charge, follow someone else's lead, or refuse to do either. Uncertainty avoidance, it's another value. This can shape whether disagreement feels like a productive step or a signal that the group is broken. When we assign a group project and say, work together, we are asking students to resolve questions that people have very different beliefs about. For example, who leads? How do we make decisions? What do we do when we disagree? Students who've never been given tools to negotiate these questions will default to whatever they were socialized to expect and experience confusion or conflict when their group members expect something completely different. And a fourth question, specifically for this audience. Can we do this asynchronously? Or does collaboration require being together? A student who is a working parent has a fundamentally different relationship to "let's meet Thursday at 7." Students with the most constraints bear the most burden. That is also a design problem. And so the design response here is a group norms negotiation. Not a team building exercise. It's a design intervention that surfaces and makes explicit the cultural assumptions that will otherwise likely derail the collaboration. So, before the work begins, give students structured questions to discuss as a group. How will you make decisions? How will your group handle disagreement? What does it look like when someone needs to step back? How will you communicate? And what's the async backup? So rather than imposing answers, you're giving students a structured opportunity to discover where their interpersonal assumptions diverge before those divergences become conflict. The research on socio-constructivism is clear. The social negotiation of meaning is where deep learning happens. But that requires a negotiation that is psychologically safe, that has shared norms. And those types of structures don't just appear by accident, they're by design. So, the third example I want to unpack brings together help seeking and collaboration in the context of academic success. In dominant American academic culture, independence is tightly coupled with competence. If you need scaffolding, support, or additional resources, the implicit message in many learning environments is that you're behind, that these supports signal a deficit. For students operating from perhaps a collectivist belief system, this is backwards. Strategic help seeking in many cultural traditions is not weakness, it is wisdom. Knowing what resources exist and how to use them is a form of intelligence. The students who most need scaffolding are often the students most likely to experience it as a deficit signal because the cultural framing of the classroom has told them that needing support means they're deficient. Again, this is not a this is a design problem, not a student problem. So, the design response is to reframe scaffolding explicitly, not just in your own head, but out loud in the room. For example, you might say that most expert learners in any field don't work alone. Using the tools I've given you is not a sign you're behind. It's a sign you're learning how to learn. It helps them to use resources strategically. Most experts ask colleagues, they look things up. So again, you're explaining why you're giving the tools and helping them understand that it's a sign that you're learning how to learn, which we all know is an important skill that for many does need to be taught. Through this reframing scaffolding as a strategy technique, you make support structures available to everyone by default. When office hours, tutoring, and annotated examples and revision opportunities are built into the course, you design for everyone, not offered as accommodations to specific students. You strip away the stigma. And critically, you create space for both individual achievement and collaborative learning pathways. When you design for multiple modes of demonstration, you stop forcing students to choose between their cultural and their personal identities and their academic success. Okay, this is where we're going to jump into some practical tools. Everything that follows from this slide on is an expression of one principle because beliefs and norms about a value is where humans tend to diverge. Let's make expected norms explicit. And this is a part of the mission and vision of my company, actually, which is clarity is kindness after all. So I'll say that one more time. Because beliefs and norms about a value is where humans tend to diverge, let's make expected norms explicit. You make norms explicit not just by talking about them, but by designing them into the structures, tools, and everyday interaction of your classroom. So, not just by writing them on a syllabus, not just by telling students what you expect. You make norms explicit by designing them into the structures, tools, and everyday interactions of your classroom. The difference between a classroom that says questions are welcome here and one that is actually designed so that asking a question doesn't require a student to overcome social fear. That difference is structural and it lives in the design. Let's start with academic norms, the rules of your classroom that aren't in your syllabus, but that students are expected to know. For example, how many times can a student revise and resubmit work? What are your actual norms around grade negotiation? Is it acceptable to ask? And if so, how? What does it mean when you say participation counts? What does late mean? And what actually happens when someone is late? These questions seem administrative, but they're not. When expectations are invisible, the students who decode them fastest are not always the students who know the most. They are often the students who grew up in environments that looked the most like this one. So, name it, write it down, put it where they can find it. That is an act of equity. Four participation structures to leave here with today. First, anonymous feedback tools. Poll Everywhere is a great one. But as I mentioned, when I first started out doing this, we didn't have a lot of digital options, but we certainly do now. Anonymous discussion submissions, for example, index cards at the end of class. These remove the social risk from honest sharing. It's not a workaround, it's a design choice that produces more honest information from everyone. Second, back channel options. Not every student processes out loud in real time. Discussion boards, asynchronous response, written pre work before in class discussion. For some learners, these are the conditions under which deep thinking actually happens. I've had a lot of success by incorporating discussion boards and back channel resources like Slack, for example, and having them work in tandem with my live, virtual, or face to face classrooms. Third, pushed output strategies. Before a whole class discussion, everyone writes for 2 minutes. You're building a structured opportunity for every student to generate thinking, not just the three students who are always ready to go first. Fourth, opt out signals. These ones are really important. These are a low stakes way for students to signal on a given day that they are not in a place to be called on. This is not lowering expectations. It's acknowledging that capacity fluctuates day to day, sometimes hour to hour. None of these are accommodations. They are intentional design choices that are available to every student. The last practical tool is modeling. I mentioned this earlier and I want to come full circle with it because it's that important. And I truly mean this in a specific research grounded sense. My doctoral research and my teacher education work consistently returned to the same finding. When instructors make their cognitive process visible, i.e., when they think out loud about uncertainty, revision, and not knowing, students learn that those states are survivable, that they are part of the process. For example, you could say, I'm not sure about this, but here's my thinking in front of your students. Revise a claim you made in a previous class. Ask a question that you don't have an answer to. Show them what intellectual humility looks like in practice. Because what students are often afraid of is not getting the wrong answer. They are afraid of being seen getting the wrong answer. When the person with the most authority in the room models uncertainty without consequence, that changes something. That is community building through pedagogy. So now we move on to our closing and wrap up. I want to bring you back to where we started, that classroom in Seoul, South Korea, that silence that I faced, and the question I had to learn to ask, which was not, why aren't they participating? But what am I assuming participation should look like? Learning doesn't happen inside individual minds. Um, let me start over. Learning doesn't happen inside individual minds in isolation. It happens, in fact, in the space between people, in the moment of a question asked and answered, in the friction of a collaborative disagreement, in the experience of being seen and understood by someone who might have assumed that you were disengaged. That space is always cultural. It is shaped by the norms we carry into the room, the ones we inherited, the ones we were taught, the ones we've never examined. And it is always designed, either by intention or by default. The question is whether your design is intentional. Community is not something you build on the first day of class and then maintain. It is something you rebuild, reinforce, and redesign in every interaction. Every time you name a norm that was invisible, every time you create a pathway for a question that wouldn't otherwise get asked, every time you model that not knowing is a legitimate part of the process, that is the work. And it is not extra work on top of teaching. It is the conditions that make teaching possible. I want to leave you with one question to take forward, and I would love for you to share your thoughts in the chat. Whose cultural norms am I assuming are universal? Not because the answer is simple, but because asking it consistently, rigorously, as a design practice is what separates a classroom that works for the students who were already going to succeed from a classroom that genuinely expands who gets to learn. Thank you. And I have never finished a talk on time in my life, so today is a good day. Okay, so now that I'm not screen sharing, I can see the chat. Um, from a more collectivist perspective. Oop, I lost it. Somebody coming in now. This is so great. So go ahead and we do have a couple of. Wait, do we have? How much time do we have for questions, Elizabeth?
Yeah, we had about 10 minutes, and I think there might be one already in the Q&A, and then I did see some questions pop up just in the regular chat as well.
Oh, there is a Q&A section. Okay. Is collaboration about willpower or team spirit? Um, this is a very interesting question, and I will tell you all that the framework that I presented to you from uh, uh, Marshall and DeCapua. So the reason I selected that framework is because the framework of values, beliefs, norms, and attitudes is their way of defining culture from a completely objective perspective. And I think that's really important. And the reason I chose to start off with a story about Seoul and, and then talk about how the way I was teaching in Seoul translated so seamlessly and so well to my students here in the United States was to demonstrate to you that I think there is a culture is a misnomer, or there's a misconception that culture is a big C culture. It is clothing, it's language, it's food, that it immediately implies international. But one of the phrases that I said to you earlier was culture isn't international, it's interpersonal. And so when I take that values, beliefs, norms, attitude framework and I break it down with people when I was a teacher, when I did this as a teacher educator at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, it was an institution, mainly locals, mainly people who were born and raised in Pittsburgh that attended this institution. And when we would unpack their beliefs and their norms and their attitudes about a shared value, there was just as much divergence between two high school friends as there was between an international student and a local student. So I think that's what's really important. And the point what I'm getting to with your question is, um, let me remind myself, is collaboration about willpower or team spirit? It depends on what you believe is true. Because collaboration it can be defined as an abstract noun, and we can all agree that collaboration is important. But whether or not you believe it takes personal willpower, so perhaps that's an individualist perspective, or you take the team spirit approach, which is a collectivist perspective. It truly just depends on your belief and your culture. My classroom is set up in groups. How can I assign roles within those groups? So something I like to do is allow students, I give students a list of roles. So here are the 4 roles that need to be assigned. Often I find students are more than happy to assign themselves. Then they get to have some autonomy and take some ownership. If I find that the group is struggling because maybe they have some power distance issues and they're feeling a little uncomfortable speaking up and taking ownership of that responsibility, then I will assign the roles to them. But the important thing about assigning roles is that make sure the roles all have very descriptive of what the role's job is, right? So that they don't have to guess and they're able to just jump into the groups and start working straight away. Um, okay, I've got a question. How do we gauge the beliefs of our classroom when it's not culturally homogenous, as classrooms often are in New York City where I teach? Uh, this is a great question because that also is how I started out teaching in very non-homogenous cultural classrooms. And I think one of the great things that you can do here is, first of all, start discussion. Start discussion around um, what does doing school look like where you come from, and what are your beliefs around how to collaborate and how to uh, how to request help. And this is something that you can do as a classroom, as an exercise. And I think what is really helpful is that, first of all, you get to know your students' beliefs, but from a peer to peer perspective, as a shared classroom experience, it's really wonderful for the other students to see how beliefs can vary across the room. And like I said, not just among uh, different big C cultures, but also among perhaps somebody that grew up across the street from you or even grew up in your same household. And it's also modeling a really good practice as well. Um, so I'll do one more question here. When it comes to people like myself, first gen graduates, that was me. I was actually the first person in my family to graduate high school. I've noticed that we're taught to approach things very differently than those who have many family members who have gone to college. I'm now in a doctoral program. Congratulations. And I'm struggling with staying from the negative parts of my culture. Do you know any frameworks I can specifically study to address this in myself? Um, Actually, the beliefs, norms, value framework, I think it's just such an incredible way to keep it very objective. And one thing I like to do is I start with the value. So, for example, if the value is success, right? You can make two columns. So I start with value at the bottom. Value is the root. And then I draw a tree upwards. And so at the just above the root of value, we have beliefs. And then uh, beliefs stem out into norms. And then from those norms at the top, we have the attitudes. The attitudes are the things that we can see. Uh, and so make two columns. Start with a value of success and then make two branches. What do I believe is true about success? What does my family believe is true about success? And then take another look at what those norms are as a result of those, and then what the attitudes are when those norms are violated or upheld. And I think looking at those two things side by side can really help you take an objective approach to what is going to help you be more successful versus what are some of the limiting beliefs that you're still carrying from some behaviors that were modeled to you? Um, oh, James is also from Pittsburgh and he knows about Duquesne University. Yeah, that's where I got my master's and my doctorate from. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, by the way. Um, okay, I think that's all the time we have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vanorsdale, for all the valuable information you shared with us today.